Chapter 8, The Mysterious Death of Vince Foster, Part 1. Foster served as Deputy White House Counsel during the first Clinton administration for 6 months before his death. But before heading to the nation's capital, he spent most of his life in Hope, Arkansas, where he and childhood friend and future President Bill Clinton were neighbors. Now, he worked at the Rose Law Firm in Little Rock and became close with Hillary Clinton, who called him Vincenzo. And when the Clintons went to Washington after the 1992 election, Foster went with them. But Foster's term in the White House was an introduction to hard-knock Beltway politics. He was largely responsible for handling the Travelgate scandal and was responsible for dealing with all the First family's paperwork related to Whitewater. Those first months of 1993 were tough on Foster. He was targeted by a series of Wall Street Journal editorials and battled with clinical depression. All of that changed on July 20th, 1993. That was the day that Vince Foster got in his car and drove to Fort Marcy Park in Virginia, and he supposedly walked through the woods, and depending on which version of the story that you believe, he took his own life. In the weeks that followed, Foster's death became a topic of national debate. With Whitewater and Travelgate hanging like clouds over the new administration, questions were immediately raised about Foster's connection to some sensitive documents that may have been in his possession. 2 years after Foster's death, a Secret Service officer by the name of Henry O'Neill Jr., an 18-year veteran of the White House detail, testified at the Whitewater Committee hearings that he saw Margaret Williams, the First Lady's chief of staff, carry a stack of file folders out of Foster's West Wing office. When first questioned about the officer's statements, she said she was merely visiting his office because she saw the light on and had a momentary irrational hope that she would walk in and find Vince Foster there. At 10 a.m. on July 22nd, 2 days after Foster's death, Justice Department officials went to review Foster's papers in his office. But White House counsel Bernard Nussbaum was standing at the door, refusing to allow them in until he had reviewed the documents himself. Former Wall Street Journal editor James Stewart described some of the happenings around Foster's office in his book called Blood Sport. Quote, "There were a flurry of phone calls the next morning. Susan Thomases spoke to Hillary in Little Rock from 7:57 to 8 a.m. Then had Nussbaum paged just a minute later, leaving a phone number at the Washington hotel where she was staying. When he reached her, she asked, 'Well, what are you doing and why are you doing it this way?' And when he explained his approach, she said, 'It sounds fine to me.' Nussbaum told the Whitewater Committee that he didn't recall making such a comment, and Thomases denied the First Lady expressed any concerns about Foster's files. At one of the only press conferences Mrs. Clinton gave about Whitewater, she expressed her thoughts on the Nussbaum controversy, saying, quote, 'I think that what happened is that after Mr. Nussbaum reviewed the documents, and after he did so, as I recall, I was not there, I was in Arkansas, but I believe that that was done in the presence of officials from the Park Police and maybe some other agencies. Then Mr. Nussbaum distributed the files according to whom he thought should have them.' When asked what the files were, Clinton responded, quote, 'There were personal files of Vincent's that needed to go to his family, and there were personal files of ours that went to our lawyer. But the files weren't the only thing of interest found in Foster's office.' Days after his death and after Nussbaum had gone through Foster's things, the First Lady's assistant, Maggie Williams, found a suicide note in Foster's briefcase. One member of the Park Police said later that there was no way to miss the note the first time around, but Nussbaum insisted that he had, and it was nothing more than an oversight. Deputy Attorney General Philip P. Heyman stood up for Nussbaum, saying that he was convinced the White House counsel wasn't trying to hide anything. But why then the runaround about the documents in the office? Were they really personal files? In 1996, the New York Times investigated the Whitewater paper trail, and they reported, quote, 'Documents relating to Mrs. Clinton's legal work for Madison Guarantee were evaluated for political sensitivity by two people who later became senior government officials, Associate Attorney General Mr. Webb Hubbell and Mr. Foster. They were given to Mr. Foster and wound up in the White House living quarters and were stored in the basement of the Justice Department's third-ranking official, Mr. Hubbell, who was looking out for the Clintons' political interests, not his law enforcement duties. The missing files were later found in a closet in the presidential wing of the White House, but they hadn't been secure, meaning that they could have been tampered with before they were finally turned over to the president's personal attorney, Bruce Lindsay, and later to the independent counsel. Now, these are just some of the mysteries surrounding the death of Vince Foster. Did he have in his possession papers that could have impacted the Whitewater investigation? How was the suicide note missed? In the minds of some, these questions may have provided a motive for foul play. But the most heated debate over Foster's death wasn't political. It had to do with old-fashioned police work, and that's where we'll pick up next week when we open up another chapter in the Clintons.